judge the Trump administration, you can look at the words of the national security strategy. But as someone who's been involved in diplomacy and watching international relations only for 55 years, I can tell you at the end of the day, the words don't matter, the deeds do. And you got to look at the actual policies and actions of the Trump administration towards China. And there's no doubt that overall, the Trump administration is behaving much more realistically and pragmatically towards China than, say, the previous Biden administration was, which was actually had a very strong ideological bent when it came to China. And I think this realistic, pragmatic attitude of Trump, by the way, after a few punch ups, the Trump administration did raise tariffs on China to 145%. Okay. So, I mean, there were punch ups along the way. But at the end of the day, they seem to have settled into a groove where they've decided that both sides have to learn to live with each other. And here, I think the most important development in US China relations is that probably for the first time since the Opium War of 1842, China was able to retaliate against a great power by its restrictions on rare earths and telling them you can no longer push me around. So the whole balance has changed in the US-China relationship. I think it'll take some time for both the United States and China to adjust to this relationship, but I would give President Trump some credit for at least trying to approach it in a realistic, pragmatic way.
Well, as Kishore pointed out, there is a fundamental difference between actual policy and what is written down on paper. And I think if you look at the national security strategy, this new document that's been issued, I like it a lot, at least the basic framework in the document, because it does reflect on my views on what U.S. grand strategy should be. But in terms of actual policy, I think there's a real disjuncture between what the Trump administration has done and what is said in those pages of the national security strategy. And if you look at what President Trump has done, he's really messed up on China, as Kishore was alluding to. He started off by playing hardball with the Chinese, thinking he could push the Chinese around. And the Chinese quickly reminded him that they had cards to play and they could make life miserable for the Americans. So he had to back off. I think you could make an argument that he's been humiliated by the Chinese. Furthermore, he's got us into this mess in Venezuela, which I don't see how he gets out of. He went to war against the Houthis this past summer, promising that he was going to win a decisive victory very quickly. After 1 month, he quit, admitted the Houthis were tough hombres and he couldn't beat them. He went to war against Iran with the Israelis. They claimed it was a great success at the time, but if it's such a great success, why are they talking about attacking Iran again? Furthermore, Trump, like Biden, is complicit in the genocide in Gaza. He makes all these claims about shutting down this war and that war. If you look closely at what he's done no such thing. And the best evidence of that is the Ukraine war. He said he was going to shut it down before he entered the White House. And if not then, shortly after he got into the White House. He's failed to shut down the war in Ukraine. It goes on and on. So if you look at his policy performance, it is a pretty negative assessment is due on it. And I don't think it reflects the more balanced view of how to deal with the world that's found in the national security strategy. How Trump talks about dealing with China is fine by me. And the fact that they've given $11.1 billion to Taiwan is fine by me. So I'm not criticizing that. What I was criticizing was the fact that early in his administration, he decided he was going to play hardball with the Chinese. And the Chinese told him, you're not playing hardball with us, because if we play hardball with you, we'll win in that competition. And the fact is, the Chinese beat him. He backed off. He clearly backed off. And with regard to the Middle East, Hezbollah is alive. It's well armed, and it's not going away. Hamas has not been defeated. It's not going away. And again, I would remind you that Trump is complicit in a genocide, which, according to most people in the world, is the greatest of all crimes. And with regard to Iran, if it was such a great success, why are they talking about attacking Iran again? Because it wasn't such a great success. And the idea that they shut down the nuclear enrichment program in Iran forever is a myth. That's not true at all. They didn't solve that problem.
That vis-a-vis the other nuclear powers, Trump understands that you're playing with fire if you push around the other nuclear powers in the war situation. I mean, you can impose trade sanctions, that's fine. Trade sanctions are not going to lead to war, but he's very, and that's why you notice that on even though he clearly hasn't succeeded yet in achieving a peace deal in Ukraine, I can tell you that the Europeans are absolutely terrified by what Trump is trying to do, which is trying to reach some kind of understanding with Russia, some kind of agreement to say at the end of the day, this war has to end. Now, he's, of course, discovering, as John highlighted, that it is never easy to switch off a war that's been going on for a couple of years. It takes a lot of hard work and thing. But at the same time, I thought that by now, with so much European resistance and European lobbying and European, to quote Susan Glasser, the European strategy of strategic self-abasement, kowtowing to Trump, that they might be able to nudge him away from his efforts to try and stop the war in Ukraine. He hasn't stopped doing it. He hasn't stopped trying. Okay, he hasn't succeeded, but he hasn't stopped trying. And the fact that he's handling the nuclear, especially the major nuclear powers, China and Russia, very carefully. I think when future historians look at Donald Trump, I suspect that the biggest positive tribute they would give to him is that he sort of recognizes that the era of the Western domination of world history is over, and the United States and the West has got to learn to live with people who are very different, and you don't try and change their societies. So, for example, categorically, he said on Saudi Arabia, it's not our mission to change Saudi Arabia's political system, right? That's something that no other previous administration would say. They would say,
Yeah.
"Oh no, we must push our values and so on and so forth." But just by saying that it is not our mission to push values, Western values, down the throats of other countries, we just have to go to accept that they have different societies and to live with them.
Trump got into a trade war with the Chinese, as I emphasized before. And he thought that he held the upper hand. And it turned out that he did not have the upper hand. And he's been forced to make compromises. And this is one of the compromises that he's been forced to make. The Chinese have been playing hardball with him. They started on April 4th when they made it clear that they were going to curtail the flow of rare earths, and especially rare earth magnets, into the United States. And then on October 2nd, the Chinese explicitly upped the ante. And this was a huge problem for the Trump administration. And furthermore, as you know, Trump depends heavily on support from farmers. And the Chinese said they were going to stop importing American soybeans. And this was a huge problem. So what's happening here is that Trump on the trade front is being forced to make certain concessions. And with regard to the H200 chip that he's now agreed to sell to China, you see evidence of the extent to which he's been forced to back off. And by the way, I'll give you another example that I think is an important one, is where he didn't really stand up and back the Japanese prime minister when she said on November 7th that if the Chinese were to attack Taiwan, that would be seen by Japan as a threat to its survival, or it might be seen by Japan as a threat to its survival. You would have thought that the Trump administration would have immediately backed her, but they did not.
By the way, you're absolutely right in your first statement that countries in the region want to see the United States stay engaged in the region. You're right. Not just for the reason you mentioned of deterring China, but also many countries in the region have had very, very long-standing relationships with the United States. And as you know, in Southeast Asia and the ASEAN region, there are huge reservoirs of goodwill towards the United States. But that said, I would say the story is much more complicated than the one you present, that the countries in the region were looking for United States as an insurance against China. And the reason the reason why the story is much more complicated than the way you portray it is that there are over 50 states in Asia. And you mentioned 5. And you're right. You mentioned 4 states and 1 Taiwan. So if you look overall, there's no question that China's relations with the majority of states in Asia is on a very positive track. And all you have to do is look at the statements that are coming out from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from Thailand, from Bangladesh. You can get a sense of how states around the region are coming to terms with the fact that China is emerging as a new great power. And by the way, this is 2,000 years of history.
Yeah.
When a great power emerges in your neighborhood, okay, the wisest thing you have to do is to adjust to the fact that the new great power has arrived in your neighborhood. And this is where, frankly, the pragmatism of the Asian states overall is a big asset. We're not choosing sides. We're not saying we're going to be with United States against China. We're not saying we're going to be with China against United States. We say, no, we're going to be friends with both of you. And we're going to live with both of you. And that I think is the dominant strain. Now, when you mention the specific cases, I frankly think that it was a huge mistake for the Japanese Prime Minister to make a pronouncement about Taiwan, because at the end of the day, the Chinese, one of the things that China wants to do is to remove all traces of the century of humiliation. And one of the lowest points of the century of humiliation was when Japan seized Taiwan from China after winning the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So that being such a sore point in the China-Japan relations, it was an absolute mistake for the Japanese Prime Minister to say things in the way that she did so. And by the way, John is right. President Trump didn't support Japan when she made that statement. So I would emphasize to you, the key point is don't push things into a binary black and white choices. The story is very complex, and countries have very complex relationships with China and with the United States.
I think that there is no question that China is interested in dominating East Asia. It's interested in becoming a regional hegemon. And I think it made good sense for the United States to give Taiwan $11.1 billion in military aid. And I also think it made good sense for the Japanese Prime Minister to say, in effect, that Japan would come to the defense of Taiwan. If you're interested in containing China and preventing China from becoming a regional hegemon, which most states in East Asia are interested in doing, and the United States is certainly interested in doing, you have to create a balancing coalition, and you have to have a clear deterrence policy. And the Chinese are determined to capture Taiwan. And I've studied the issue quite carefully, and I believe that if Japan and the United States, and even Australia, but Japan and the United States mainly, come to the defense of Taiwan, I think that the Chinese cannot capture Taiwan, and they will therefore not attempt to capture Taiwan, and you will avoid war. So I think it makes good sense for the United States and for Japan and even for Australia to make it clear to the Chinese, not in a provocative way, but in a clear and concise way, that they will come to the defense of Taiwan should China try to conquer it. Because I think that facilitates deterrence. And I'm deeply interested in making sure that we avoid war in East Asia.
Well, I would say, if you want me to be very blunt, if Australia follows John's advice and says that it will stand up and defend Taiwan, it is committing geopolitical suicide. Because at the end of the day, geography matters. Geopolitics is a combination of two words, geography and politics. And remember, with Western power, will recede more and more from Asia. Australia, as I've said before, will be left as the lonely Western outpost in Asia. And is therefore in Australia's interest to see how the other Asian countries are handling China's rise and also handling the sensitive Taiwan question. This doesn't mean they're saying that Taiwan should be handed back to China immediately. No. But they're also saying that the Taiwan issue has got to be handled very carefully, very delicately to avoid any kind of war over the region. And remember, at the end of the day, the United States has clearly, since World War II, ensured that it never got into a direct military conflict against another nuclear power. You use proxies, fair enough, but you never get engaged yourself directly in a war against the Soviet Union, for example. So therefore, in the question of Taiwan, what the Asian countries are doing is that they understand the sensitivity of the issue, and therefore they're managing it very carefully and very delicately. And I would say it's in Australia's best interest to watch what ASEAN is doing and see what Australia can learn from ASEAN, rather than say, okay, we will join the United States and attack.
Let me explain. First of all, the reason that China is a serious threat to the United States and Russia is not is because China is a threat to dominate all of East Asia. It is a threat to become a regional hegemon. And the United States does not tolerate regional hegemons. There were four potential regional hegemons in the 20th century: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the United States. We played a key role in putting all four of those countries on the scrap heap of history. We do not tolerate regional hegemons. That means we will contain China. Russia is not even a threat to conquer all of Ukraine, much less dominate all of Europe. It is not a potential regional hegemon. In fact, we should have good relations with Russia. Russia should be an ally of ours in trying to contain China. The fact that it isn't is a remnant of this foolish war in Ukraine. Now, my second point is regarding what's good for the goose is good for the gander. As you know well, Tom, we have a Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine basically says that the Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence and no
Since
great
the
power.
1820s.
1823. And the basic precept of the Monroe Doctrine is that no distant great power is allowed to put military forces in the Western Hemisphere or form a military alliance with a state in the Western Hemisphere. Now, of course, the Chinese prefer to have a Monroe Doctrine of their own. They do not want the United States on their doorstep. They do not want the United States in their face. And I don't blame them one bit. As I have said on numerous occasions, if I was the national security advisor to Xi Jinping, I'd tell him we have to do everything we can to push the Americans beyond the first
But
island
John, if
chain,
Donald Trump was
then push
listening
them
to this,
beyond
he'd
the
say, give
second
them some
island
slack.
chain.
Cut them some slack. Why not cut the Chinese some slack? That's what Donald Trump would say to you.
Tom, if you're a great power and you're faced with a potential regional hegemon, you don't talk about cutting them slack. At least in the realist world that I operate in, you go to great lengths to contain them. And that's what we should be doing. And that's what we are doing, as the national security document that just came out made clear. Containment of China is imperative for the United States. It's imperative for Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia as well.
Well, I would say be careful about using analogies from the 20th century century in the 21st century. So yes, the United States buried Imperial Germany, United States buried Imperial Japan, but the whole logic of history and the way in which countries dealt with each other was very, very different. That was a much more, I would call it an imperialistic world. And remember that until about the middle of 20th century, most of the world was colonized by the West, right? Remember how the 100,000 Englishmen could rule over 300 million Indians effortlessly, exactly 100 years ago, 1925. So you can see, therefore, that was the tenor and chemistry of history in the early 20th century. But this is the 21st century, and countries are much more interdependent in deeper ways than they have ever been. And clearly, China has anticipated this containment strategy that John mentioned, and it has carried out a preemptive strike against any such containment strategy by making sure that most countries in the world trade more with China than they do with the United States of America. And remember that one of the things that gave the United States such amazing power at the end of World War II is that it had about 50% of the world's GNP at the time. And I suspect, John can probably has its data, 60 to 70% of manufacturing capacity of the world at the end of World War II. I suspect that was the United States' position in the world. Now, I want to remind you that in the 21st century, when it opened in the year 2000, China's share of global manufacturing capacity was 5%. Now it is already reaching 30%. And by 2030, it's going to hit 45%. Now, this has made China an indispensable supplier of products to every country in the world. And believe me, in the scenario that John mentioned earlier of a war breaking out, let's say between US and China, the United States would suddenly find that all kinds of spare parts that it needs for all kinds of things, all kinds of machines, aircraft, and so on and so forth, you'll suddenly hit a critical shortage. So therefore, in this interdependent world, to talk of using 20th century analogies of containment and so on and so forth will not work in the 21st century. And I can also tell you that for the vast majority of countries in the world are much more autonomous actors in the 21st century than they were in the 20th century. And therefore, they themselves are not going to join any kind of games that easily in the way that you did in the Cold War, for example. And remember, the Cold War, United States had allies, not just in Western Europe, not just in Japan or South Korea. It also had Indonesia, it had Pakistan, it had Egypt, it had Zaire. Now those days are gone. That kind of lining up to join a containment policy is not going to happen.
Okay, so
And
John,
therefore, I would say deal with the 21st century and the interdependent world we're living in, because that's the reality for most states in the world.
Because the more powerful China gets, the more other countries fear it, and the more interested they are in balancing with the United States against China. First of all, the Chinese think much more the way I think than Kishore thinks. The Chinese believe in balance of power politics. They're realists to the core. As he pointed out before, they suffered the century of national humiliation. That taught them that you don't want to be weak. The Chinese also fully recognize that the United States is one of the most ruthless great powers in recorded history, and they want to do everything they can to make sure that the balance of power favors them and not the United States. They're realists, and they understand that the best thing they can do is to achieve regional hegemony in East Asia, which means driving the Americans out beyond the first island chain and the second island chain. They want their Monroe Doctrine. They should have a Monroe Doctrine from their own point of view. But you want to remember that the United States doesn't want them to dominate Asia, and most countries in East Asia don't want them to dominate East Asia. So it will not be that difficult for the United States to put together a balancing coalition. And you want to remember, Kishore, that the United States, it's not as powerful in relative terms as it once was, is still a remarkably powerful country, and it's armed with nuclear weapons. And that is a country, the United States, that is bent on containing China. And you never want to bet against the United States.
Well, there's no question that since I wrote the book, Has China Won? In relative terms, China's position has become much stronger, not just economically, but as I mentioned, in terms of its manufacturing capacity in the world. And also, frankly, as you know, the allies of the United States are questioning their relations with the United States. I mean, this is not me saying anything new. I mean, look at how terrified Europe is today. And if you look, for example, at another country, take India, for example, for 27 years, the United States has been courting India since Bill Clinton's famous visit to India, discovery of India trip. And then you had George W. Bush courting India. You had Barack Obama courting India. But you can see how all this courtship of India has come to a halt over the last few months. And I'm sure the Indians are asking themselves this simple question: isn't it better for India to be an independent, autonomous player in this new geopolitical game, rather than to be an ally of the United States or an enemy of China? Why not be an independent force on this stage? And so therefore, the geopolitical picture of the world is, I want to emphasize this point, is very complicated because countries are recalculating their national interests very carefully. And the sort of coalition that John is speaking about, of a kind of a global or even a regional coalition against China, isn't going to emerge.
Well, I think when you talk about who won, there's no way you can give an answer to that question at this point in time. What you have taking place here is a security competition between two great powers, between the United States and China. And neither side has won. There's no question that China has gotten increasingly powerful vis-a-vis the United States since the early 1990s. And it may even get more powerful relative to the United States over the next decade. But that certainly doesn't mean that China has won. With regard to India, I think there's no question that the Trump administration has blown it, right? We had worked for about 27 years, as Kishore said, to greatly improve relations with India. And when Trump first took over, Modi was one of the first people to come visit him in the White House. And it looked like we were going to continue to have good relations. And as both of you know, it was in our strategic interest, America's strategic interest, to have good relations with India. And then, in large part because of the Ukraine war, Trump turned on the Indians, and he has, in good part, poisoned relations with India, which is not in America's strategic interest. But this is just another example of how Trump has mishandled American foreign policy. But this doesn't mean that we're not going to try to contain China. And it does also not mean that we will not work with India more and more over time once we get the Ukraine war behind us, because it's in our strategic interest, and it's also in India's strategic interest to work with us, because China is a threat to India, despite what Kishore thinks.